They made him strip off his prosthetic leg in front of everyone, their voices sharp, their eyes cold, treating him not like a man but like a problem to be inspected and discarded. A black man, limping through their pristine terminal, was all they saw. They shoved his belongings onto the floor, laughed when he stumbled, and barked orders as if he were a criminal hiding behind a broken body. No one asked his name. No one paused to wonder how he had come to carry such wounds. They just assumed he was another burden, another mistake they had to tolerate. As he struggled to reattach his leg, the security officers smirked, and passengers turned away, pretending not to notice the cruelty they had become complicit in. What they didn't know, what they couldn't even imagine, was that the man they humiliated had once carried hundreds of lives through hell and saved them all. His story wasn't written on his skin or his limp. It was etched into history, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. If you believe stories like this matter, like this video, subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments where are you watching from and what part of this story hit you hardest. The afternoon sun poured through the towering glass walls of the airport terminal, casting long golden beams across the polished floors. Marcus Hayes maneuvered through the bustling crowd with a quiet resilience, the faint metallic clink of his prosthetic leg a steady companion to his steps. Dressed in a simple navy jacket and khaki trousers, his presence was humble, yet somehow commanding, the kind of aura that made strangers glance twice without understanding why. His face bore the lines of experience, etched with stories he seldom told, and his dark eyes held a calm that could steady a storm. Marcus had known chaos. He had walked through fire and returned bearing invisible scars far deeper than the visible ones. But here, he was just another traveler, just another man trying to catch a flight home. At the security checkpoint, a cluster of transportation security officers bustled about, their voices curt, their movements. Marcus approached the line designated for travelers needing assistance, his boarding pass and ID ready in hand. As he drew nearer, a young officer with a buzz cut and a too-tight uniform narrowed his eyes at him, scrutinizing him in a way that made Marcus instinctively brace himself. "Step aside, sir," the officer barked, not bothering to lower his voice. Marcus complied without a word, moving carefully to avoid tripping as his prosthetic adjusted to the sudden shift in momentum. "Take off your shoe and remove that," the officer said, waving vaguely at Marcus's leg as if it were some contraband item. Marcus hesitated, not from reluctance, but from the absurdity of the command. Removing his prosthesis wasn't a simple act. It was a painful and exposing process, yet he said nothing. Instead, he began unfastening the cuff and detaching the limb with practiced efficiency, balancing himself with quiet dignity. Around him, other passengers watched with mild curiosity or uncomfortable avoidance, but no one intervened. "Hurry up," the officer snapped, tapping his foot impatiently. As Marcus finally placed his prosthetic leg and shoe into the gray plastic bin. "Got to check everything, you know," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Another officer, a middle-aged man with graying hair, joined him and let out a scoffing laugh. "Yeah, sometimes folks get creative. Could be hiding anything in there." Marcus caught the insinuation but kept his gaze steady, refusing to rise to the bait. He had faced far worse than verbal slights, and he wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing him falter. The younger officer prodded the prosthetic roughly with a gloved hand, flipping it this way and that as if expecting it to explode. When nothing happened, he shoved it back toward Marcus with little ceremony, letting it clatter noisily against the side of the table. The sound echoed off the high ceilings, drawing more stares. Marcus knelt slowly to retrieve his leg, the movement awkward and ungainly without it attached. His fingers moved with the patience of a man who had rebuilt himself piece by piece, more times than he cared to remember. As he reattached the prosthesis, the officer crossed his arms and said, "You people always think you deserve special treatment. Not today." Marcus finished securing his leg and stood tall, his expression unreadable. Words, he knew, were wasted on small minds. Instead, he picked up his small carry-on and walked forward, each step a testament to battles fought and won, far beyond the sterile walls of this terminal. As he moved away, he heard the officers snickering behind him, their voices low but carrying an unmistakable cruelty. "Bet he faked half that story to get the free ride," no one muttered. "Probably never even left the country," Jackson said, as if they knew. Practically nowhere to turn, the man at the front, Marcus kept walking, his posture straight, his head held high. He had heard worse from men whose lives he had once risked his own to protect. Today was not the day to fight this battle. But even so, a knot tightened in his chest, a slow, burning anger not born from personal insult, but from the injustice he saw reflected again and again in the world around him. He passed through the final checkpoint into the main concourse, where families bustled past with strollers, businessmen tapped furiously at their phones, and the announcements overhead buzzed with boarding calls. Life moved on, indifferent. Marcus found a seat near his gate, easing himself down carefully. He placed his small duffel on the floor beside him and leaned back, allowing himself a moment to breathe. He thought of the home he was returning to, a modest house tucked into a quiet street. He thought of the dinner waiting for him, cooked by his sister, who had promised fried chicken and cornbread. He thought of peace, of simple things. And yet, sitting there, Marcus couldn't shake the bitterness of the encounter at security. It wasn't new, it wasn't even surprising, but it still wounded in a way that never quite hardened into a scar. He glanced down at his leg metal where flesh once was, a testament to both survival and sacrifice. Would they have treated him differently if they knew the truth? Would they have saluted instead of sneering if they knew the price he had paid in distant deserts and forgotten wars? A child across the aisle stared at him with wide, innocent eyes. Marcus managed a small smile, and the boy shyly smiled back before burying his face in his mother's sleeve. Marcus turned his gaze toward the giant windows overlooking the... He told himself that this moment would pass. It always did. The anger would settle into the quiet pool of memory, joining countless others. But deep down, something told him that today would not end like other days. Today, the past might finally demand its due. Marcus adjusted his jacket as he sat quietly by the gate, trying to let the previous humiliation roll off his back like rain on a worn stone. But the damage was done, a familiar ache blooming in his chest, heavier than the prosthetic strapped to his leg, and as he stared blankly at the monitor announcing delays, his solitude was soon interrupted by the sharp clack of polished shoes approaching with purpose. When he looked up, he saw a tall man in a black blazer adorned with a TSA badge pinned sharply to the breast pocket, the kind of man whose face was permanently carved into a sneer of condescension. And before Marcus could so much as rise to greet him, the man barked, "Name?" in a tone that broke no warmth, no respect. Marcus, still composed, answered calmly, "Marcus Hayes," and extended his boarding pass and ID, without a trace of hesitation. Yet the man, whose name tag read Supervisor Rayleigh, merely glanced at them with disinterest before snapping his fingers at another officer nearby, motioning him over like someone summoning a dog. Rayleigh folded his arms, his body language thick with disdain, and said loud enough for the surrounding passengers to, "Here we got ourselves another welfare warrior playing the system," the insult slicing through the air with surgical cruelty. And although Marcus stiffened slightly, he kept his expression locked down, unwilling to allow these petty tyrants the victory of seeing him flinch. Riley continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "If you can walk, you can wait in line like everybody else. Don't think a missing leg entitles you to special treatment." And the surrounding travelers, some pretending not to listen, others openly gawking, created a circle of silent witnesses to the cruelty being performed in broad daylight. Marcus inhaled slowly, feeling the tightness of anger and humiliation pressing against his ribs, and he weighed the options: challenge the man here, risk escalation, or stay silent and endure a few more indignities to reach his gate without further incident. He chose silence not out of cowardice but strategy, and stood carefully steadying himself without complaint even as his knee ached with the sudden strain. As he moved toward the back of the already long line, Riley called after him, "That's right, soldier boy, back of the line where you belong." The words heavy with mockery, the emphasis on soldier boy twisting the title into a taunt rather than a badge of honor, and Marcus, jaw tight, kept walking without looking back, because looking back would only grant them another small, savage victory. The line was a sluggish beast, winding slowly through the checkpoint, and each step tested Marcus's endurance not just physically but emotionally. He could feel the eyes of strangers crawling over him, some with pity, most with judgment. And though no words were spoken aloud, the collective murmur of assumptions was deafening. Fake or burden, inconvenience. He focused on his breathing, willing himself toward patience. thinking of his sister's smile, of the kitchen light spilling warm across polished counters, of the simple peace that awaited him beyond this place. But those fragile thoughts were shattered when another figure blocked his path. A female officer, slim and stiff-barked, with dark hair pulled so tightly into a bun it seemed to induce grimace. "Need assistance?" she asked, the words mechanical, her eyes skimming him with clinical detachment rather than any genuine concern. And Marcus, nodding, asked softly if she could help stabilize his bag so he wouldn't lose balance adjusting his prosthetic again. For a moment the woman hesitated, her lips pursing in an expression not of consideration but irritation, and then, in a voice barely above a mutter, she sneered, "Everyone these days thinks they're special just because they've got a few scars." Her words falling like stones into the heavy silence between them. Marcus blinked once, twice, absorbing the impact without outward reaction, though internally the blow registered, deep and sharp. He watched as she turned brusquely away, leaving him to manage alone, her back radiating a disdain so palpable it might as well have been a slap to the face. A couple nearby, both middle-aged and neatly dressed, exchanged a quick glance but said nothing, retreating into the comforting cocoon of their own privilege. And Marcus, refusing to let his bitterness rise to the surface, bent carefully, shifting his weight to his good leg, adjusting the strap of his duffel with meticulous care. Sweat beaded at his brow, from the effort though the terminal air was cool. But he did not falter, did not allow his body to betray his pride, even as every fiber of him screamed for the dignity that had been so callously stripped away, piece by piece, since he'd entered this building. Inch by inch, step by step, Marcus moved forward, and yet each motion felt heavier, not because of the prosthetic or the strain, but because of the cumulative weight of unseen hands pushing him down, mocking, dismissing, dehumanizing. These were battles fought without bullets but with barbed words and weaponized indifference. And in some ways, they were the harder wars to win. As he finally approached the secondary checkpoint, where another set of guards awaited, their faces already hard with skepticism before he even reached them, Marcus realized with a heavy certainty that today's journey would not be merely from airport to home, but through the full gauntlet of a society eager to diminish what it could not comprehend or respect. Marcus, having endured the supervisor's sneers and the female officer's biting dismissal, finally cleared the last security checkpoint with a weary breath. Yet as he looked around, expecting at least a modest space near his gate where he could wait, with some semblance of comfort, a different reality greeted him. An officer with a clipboard, face set like concrete, gestured sharply toward a row of seats that lined the far end of the concourse, a barren stretch isolated from the main flow of passengers, wedged between a vending machine and the stark swinging doors of the public restrooms. And despite every instinct urging him to question the placement, Marcus simply nodded, biting down the words forming behind his teeth, dragging his carry-on with a slight limp toward the designated seat, the echo of each step seeming louder as he moved further away from the bustling central lounge, filled with glossy leather chairs, soft lighting, and quiet murmurs of VIP travelers, clinking champagne glasses. The seat itself was hard, molded plastic bolted into the floor, the kind that pressed uncomfortably into his lower back, offering neither support nor dignity, and as he lowered himself carefully onto the icy surface, he caught the flickering glances of passers-by, some curious, most indifferent, a few barely disguising their disapproval as if his very presence marred their otherwise pristine travel experience. Across the wide, gleaming corridor, he could see the VIP lounge through glass walls, inviting warmth taunting him with glimpses of plush couches, complimentary drinks, and smiling staff catering to a different class of human being. Marcus set his bag by his feet and adjusted his position, trying to find a spot where the prosthetic wouldn't dig painfully into his hip. But the hard chair offered no relief. He shifted again, ignoring the ache, focusing instead on the small victories. He was still upright, still moving forward, still refusing to bend under the weight of disdain heaped upon him. Time crawled as the gate agent announced delays over the intercom, her voice cheerful and robotic, oblivious to the silent battle being fought in the neglected corners of the terminal. After nearly half an hour of enduring the stale air and the constant foot traffic to and from the restrooms, Marcus realized he would need assistance to board when his flight was finally called. He was confident in his ability to walk short distances, but the growing stiffness in his leg warned him that by the time boarding began, The pain would be significant enough to compromise his balance, so with quiet determination, he flagged down a uniformed attendant passing by with a clipboard. "Excuse me," Marcus said, voice polite but edged with the fatigue of someone forced too often to ask for what should be freely offered. "Would it be possible to arrange a wheelchair to assist with boarding?" The attendant, a young man no older than 25, barely paused, his eyes flicking over Marcus, assessing, calculating, before shaking his head briskly and muttering, "You'll have to find someone else, sir," and muttering, the words delivered without a hint of apology as he continued down the hall, without so much as a second glance. Marcus watched him go, the sting of rejection sharper somehow because of its sheer casualness, the way it suggested that his needs were an inconvenience too minor to even acknowledge properly. Undeterred, Marcus caught sight of another staff member, a woman wearing a badge that identified her as part of the mobility assistance team, and with the same even tone, he repeated his request. She barely concealed her annoyance, tapping at her tablet with unnecessary force as she said, "We're backed up, might be a while," before turning away abruptly to speak with a family that had just arrived white, affluent, their complaints about seating arrangements already met with swift smiling service. Minutes dragged by, and no one came. Each attempt Marcus made, small waves to attendants, polite gestures to passing employees, was met with the same wall of indifference, the same cold glances that slid over him as if he were in X's that sits known. The buzzing announcement overhead declared another gate change, forcing a migration of travelers down the concourse, and Marcus, realizing he would soon have to move as well, gritted his teeth against the sharp protest from his joints as he pushed himself upright, the weight of his bag unbalancing him momentarily, until he steadied himself with grim precision. Several passengers glanced in his direction during his struggle, their faces momentarily contorted by an uncomfortable awareness, yet not one stepped forward, not one offered a hand. Instead, they shuffled faster past him, eyes averted, conversations resumed, the small kindness of acknowledgement withheld as though empathy were a contagion they dared not catch. Standing now, leaning heavily on the metal support of his prosthesis, Marcus scanned the concourse for assistance, but found none. A few wheelchair attendants zipped by, steering elderly passengers or wealthy travelers toward priority boarding areas, their movements swift and practiced, never pausing long enough for Marcus to flag them down. He was an island adrift in a river of motion, stranded by a society that saw only his exterior, his missing limb, his worn jacket, his dark skin, and judged him unworthy of basic decency. A child pulling a rolling backpack slowed momentarily near Marcus, his wide eyes staring with innocent curiosity at the mechanical gleam of the prosthetic limb. But before Marcus could offer a reassuring smile, the child's mother swooped in, grabbing his hand and murmuring something urgent under her breath as she yanked him away, casting a disapproving look back at Marcus as if he were some cautionary tale. The air around him thickened with unspoken judgments, each one pressing heavier against his shoulders, yet he refused to bow. Instead, he shifted his grip on his duffel and began the slow, painful walk toward the new gate. Each step a test of resolve, each movement through the indifferent crowd a small, silent act of defiance. The gleaming signs overhead blurred into a meaningless procession of arrows and numbers as Marcus moved forward, determined to reach his destination even if no one cared whether he made it there or not. And as he limped past another row of shining leather chairs reserved for priority members, he caught the amused glance of a uniformed officer leaning lazily against a pillar, who, when Marcus met his gaze, smirked and said just loud enough to be heard, "Should have stayed home," old words cutting through the ambient noise like a blade. Marcus tightened his grip on his bag but said nothing, channeling every ounce of discipline forged from years of battlefield silence into the simple act of moving onward. Onward. Always onward. Because standing still meant giving them what they wanted, and Marcus Hayes had never been the kind of man to surrender the high ground. Marcus pressed forward through the thinning crowds of the terminal, each step scraping against his endurance, the weight of his duffel bag feeling heavier as fatigue gnawed at his muscles, and after what felt like an endless march, he finally reached the new gate posted for his flight, only to find another obstacle waiting in the form of a stern-faced ticket agent stationed at the entrance, her posture rigid, her eyes sharp with suspicion as she watched him approach. Used to the silent battles waged in glances and gestures, straightened his shoulders and presented his boarding pass without hesitation. But instead of the quick scan and polite nod afforded to the previous passengers, the agent paused, her brow furrowing deeply as she inspected the ticket, as if it were a counterfeit bill. She tilted her head and looked Marcus up and down, her gaze lingering on his prosthetic with open disdain. And then, without any explanation, she asked, "I'm going to need to check this again, sir." Her tone clipped and loud enough for several nearby passengers to turn their heads, curious and hungry for any sign of drama. Marcus, jaw tightening, handed over his ID once more, suppressing the flare of irritation burning at the edges of his patience, and the woman took her time typing into her terminal, tapping each key with exaggerated slowness as if savoring the opportunity to delay him, her lips pursed in an expression that hovered between suspicion and contempt. After several agonizing minutes, during which the line behind him began to fidget and murmur with growing impatience, she handed the documents back with a false smile that barked, "Hold on," motioning for another security officer to approach, a stocky man with a red face and a swaggering gait, who wore his authority like an ill-fitting crown. The officer stopped in front of Marcus, arms crossed, and without preamble he barked, "We need to inspect your leg." His voice pitched deliberately loud so that everyone within a 10-foot radius turned to stare, the surrounding murmur of conversation dying into an expectant hush. Marcus stared at him, momentarily stunned by the blatant audacity of the demand, and before he could even respond, the ticket agent chimed in, "We have to be sure, sir. Is that leg real or some kind of device?" Her voice dripping with a mock concern that made it clear she saw him not as a person but as a potential threat. Or worse, an inconvenience to be scrutinized and disbelieved. Every word, every exaggerated pause, was designed to maximize humiliation, to turn Marcus from a private individual into a public spectacle. And, as the watching crowd leaned in, some with morbid fascination, others with thinly veiled disgust, Marcus felt the all-too-familiar chill of isolation closing around him like a noose. He exhaled slowly, willing his voice to remain steady, and said, "It's a prosthetic issued after my service in..." But the explanation, rather than diffusing the situation, seemed only to embolden the officer, who sneered and said, "Well, if it's legitimate, you won't mind showing us, will you?" The insinuation as cutting as any knife. Marcus knew that refusal would only escalate things, that reason and dignity had no place in this kind of calculated degradation. So he bent stiffly, tugged up the cuff of his pants to reveal the gleaming metal frame of the prosthetic limb, the polished surface catching the sterile light of the terminal and reflecting back the faces of the onlookers. Some curious, some openly smirking. Satisfied, or perhaps merely bored, the officer grunted and stepped back, but not before muttering under his breath, loud enough for those nearest to hear. "Real soldiers don't whine about losing a leg, they stand tall and shut up," the comment landing like a slap against Marcus's dignity, a blow meant not to test but to break him. The ticket agent let out a short, derisive laugh, as if the officer's words were a private joke between them. And Marcus, for a moment, simply stood there, feeling the weight of every scar, every sacrifice, every moment of pain and perseverance dragged into the mud by people who would never know a fraction of what he had given. He tightened his grip on the handle of his duffel, fighting the tremor that threatened to betray his inner storm, and slowly, deliberately, lowered the cuff of his pants back over the prosthetic, restoring what little armor he had left between himself and the cruelty of a world that had long ago decided that heroes came with certain faces and certain skin tones, and he, by their standards, had neither. As the gate finally opened for boarding, Marcus moved forward, the murmur of gossip trailing in his wake like smoke from a fire, and each step felt heavier, not because of the physical weight pressing against his frame, but because of the cumulative toll of 1,000 small humiliations, each one slicing a little deeper than the last. He did not look back at the gawking faces or the smirking officials. He had learned long ago that dignity was not given by others but maintained in spite of them, a quiet rebellion that no insult could steal unless he allowed it. The scanner beeped mechanically as he passed through, the agent barely glancing at him now, her interest already fading, her appetite for cruelty temporarily sated. And Marcus pressed onward down the jet bridge, the sterile walls closing around him like the narrowing throat of some great indifferent beast. His gait was uneven, each step a struggle against the soreness building in his hip, but he kept moving, driven not by pride but by something older, deeper, the unyielding will to endure. to survive, to carry forward not just for himself but for every man and woman who had bled unseen on foreign soil, only to return to a homeland too blind to see their worth. As he neared the door of the plane, a final uniformed attendant waited, her face carefully blank, and for a brief moment, Marcus thought hope that perhaps here, finally, he might be allowed to pass without another wound to his pride. But the glint in her eye, sharp and assessing, told him otherwise. Marcus tightened his grip on the duffel as he stepped onto the plane, his gait steady despite the simmering ache in his leg, and as he approached the first row of first-class seats, the atmosphere shifted subtly but unmistakably, the kind of shift a man like Marcus could sense without needing to see it. The sharp intake of breath, the sudden stiffening of shoulders, the barely concealed glances that darted his way and then skittered off like cockroaches under a sudden light, all spoke volumes louder than words. And Marcus, too proud to show the weight pressing on his chest, simply nodded slightly to the attendant standing stiffly at the entrance and made his way toward his assigned seat. The first-class cabin was a sanctuary of hushed tones and polished luxury, where businessmen lounged in tailored suits and socialites murmured over sparkling flutes of champagne. And into this curated world of comfort Marcus stepped, his presence a jarring reminder of realities those behind gold-plated doors preferred to forget. He moved carefully down the aisle, the wheels of his bag murmuring against the plush carpet, and as he stowed his luggage overhead and lowered himself into the wide leather seat, he caught a few sharp whispers cutting through the otherwise muted hum of conversation. Across the aisle, a man with a silver watch glinting on his wrist and a tailored blazer strained across a generous middle leaned toward a uniformed security officer stationed discreetly at the cabin door, his voice low but urgent, and Marcus, trained by necessity to read faces and body language long before words were spoken, needed no imagination to understand what was happening. The man, face red with indignation, jabbed a finger in Marcus's direction and hissed, "Get him out of here. He's ruining the atmosphere. This is supposed to be first class, not some charity ward." And the security officer, a tall, impassive figure whose badge gleamed under their headed lights, didn't even bother to consult the passenger manifest or ask Marcus a single question before nodding once, Curtit alone, had simply. Marcus caught it all, the glance, the nod, the tightening of muscles as the officer shifted his weight and moved toward him. And he straightened slowly, drawing himself up, not with defiance, but with the steady, quiet dignity that had carried him through far worse than the venom of small-minded men in expensive suits. Before the officer could open his mouth to deliver whatever excuse he had prepared, a child's voice, small and clear and cutting through the tension like a blade of sunlight, rang out from the row behind Marcus. "Daddy," the boy said, his voice filled with the innocent confusion of someone not yet trained to look away from injustice. "Why are they treating him like that? What did he do wrong?" The question seemed to freeze the air in the cabin, every adult instinct instinctively tensing at the sudden raw honesty piercing through layers of polite pretense. But the father, a man in his late 30s with thinning hair and a crisp button-down shirt, didn't answer. Instead, he tightened his grip on the boy's small hand and pulled him gently but firmly closer, bending down to murmur something in his ear, though Marcus could see that no words were actually spoken, only a tight, awkward silence that begged the boy to stop asking questions. The boy resisted for a moment, looking back at Marcus with wide, wondering eyes, and Marcus, despite everything, offered the child 1,000 unsaid things. A reassurance, an admonishment, a silent promise that not every adult would fail to answer such questions honestly. But the boy's father tugged again, more urgently now, and with a confused glance over his shoulder, the child allowed himself to be led away down the aisle, their figures soon swallowed by the curve of the jet bridge, leaving behind an echo of uncomfortable truth that neither the wealthy passenger nor the indifferent officer could entirely erase. Marcus turned back to face the approaching security officer, who hesitated now, just slightly, as if the child's question had injected a flicker of doubt into his mechanical duty, but the moment passed quickly. Professionalism, no. Compliance reasserted itself in the officer's stance, and with a forced politeness that fooled no one, he said, "Sir, we're going to have to ask you to step off the plane for a few moments to verify your seating." It was a lie, transparent and hollow, but Marcus knew the game too well to challenge it head-on. He merely inclined his head in a small, controlled nod, gathered his duffel with deliberate care, and rose from his seat. Every movement measured, every breath a silent act of resistance. As he walked back up the aisle, past the first-class passengers who studiously avoided his gaze or pretended intense interest in their phones and magazines, Marcus carried himself with the unshakable grace of a man who had fought real battles and borne real losses, battles these people could not even begin to comprehend from behind their gilded walls of privilege. The security officer followed half a step behind, a looming shadow of institutional callousness, and Marcus wondered how many others had walked this same path, quietly pushed out, quietly erased, without witnesses, without acknowledgement, without justice. At the mouth of the jet bridge, another attendant waited, clipboard in hand, face carefully blank, and as Marcus approached, she glanced down, pretending to check something before nodding toward the gate desk without looking him in the eye. No apology, no explanation, just the unspoken expectation that he would move along, unseen and unchallenged. Passengers still boarding paused briefly at the sight of him, some with puzzled glances, some with faces hardening into practiced indifference, and Marcus, feeling the weight of their judgment but refusing to stoop under it, adjusted the strap of his duffel across his chest and continued forward, each step a deliberate refusal to be diminished, each breath a quiet oath not to surrender his worth to the small-minded cruelty of those who mistook wealth for valor and cruelty for strength. Marcus moved slowly toward the gate desk, the murmur of the crowd washing over him like static, his heart a steady drumbeat of control against the tide of humiliation that threatened to pull him under. And as he reached the counter, the agent behind it, a young woman with perfectly coiffed hair and a name tag that read Megan, looked up with a bright, professional smile that faltered almost immediately upon seeing him, her gaze sharpening into something more clinical, more dismissive. She tapped a few keys on her terminal with the brisk efficiency of someone processing a problem rather than a person, and Marcus, still clutching his duffel with the quiet dignity that had become his armor, waited without speaking, the space between them thick with unspoken assumptions. Megan's eyes darted to his ticket, then back to him, lingering a beat too long on the prosthetic that peeked slightly from under his trousers, and after a moment she said, "It appears there's been a seating adjustment, sir," her voice polished but empty, stripped of any true courtesy. And before Marcus could respond, she added, "You'll be reassigned to a different boarding group. Your previous upgrade is no longer available." The words delivered with the detached finality of someone closing a file rather than addressing a human being. Marcus felt the low burn of anger stir deep in his chest, a familiar ember that had flared many times before, in boardrooms, on sidewalks, in the back alleys of bureaucracies, designed to diminish men like him without ever needing to say it aloud. And he considered, briefly, challenging her, demanding the respect owed to him, not just by ticket class but by the simple fact of his humanity. But as he opened his mouth, something else pulled at him, a different memory, older and heavier than anger. Slowly, as if drawn by invisible threads, Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small object wrapped in worn cloth, unfolding it carefully to reveal a tarnished military badge, its surface scratched and dulled by years of handling, its edges worn smooth by countless moments just like this one. He cradled it in his palm for a long moment, letting his gaze fall on the familiar insignia that had once been pinned proudly to it, a silent testament to battles fought, lives saved, comrades lost, and a nation that had, in its more honorable moments, recognized sacrifice for what it was. The metal felt heavy in his hand, heavier than its modest size should allow, and for a fleeting second Marcus imagined placing it gently on the counter before Megan, forcing her to look at it, forcing her to understand, to reckon with the truth of who he was and what he had endured, to earn a place in the very world now trying so desperately to eject him. But the impulse faded almost as quickly to eject him, replaced by the weary certainty that no piece of metal, no matter how sacred, could compel respect from those determined to deny it. With a deep, steadying breath, Marcus folded the badge back into its cloth, tucking it once again into the safety of his jacket, its presence a quiet reassurance pressed close to his heart, and he lifted his chin, meeting Megan's carefully neutral gaze with a calm that bordered on defiance. "Understood," he said simply, his voice carrying none of the bitterness roiling beneath the surface, and he accepted the new boarding pass she slid toward him without further comment, the smooth plastic brushing against his calloused fingers with a cool indifference that matched the transaction itself. Megan offered no apology, no explanation, only a perfunctory nod as she turned her attention to the next passenger, a middle-aged man in a designer suit who was greeted with a warmth Marcus had not been deemed worthy to receive. And as Marcus stepped aside, the reality of the situation settled over him like a second skin, thick, unshakable. A constant reminder that here, as in so many other places, recognition of his sacrifice would not, unseen and unacknowledged. He found a seat near the new gate, a nondescript patch of worn carpet flanked by vending machines and cheap plastic chairs bolted to the floor, and he lowered himself carefully into one of them, the effort sending a fresh bolt of pain through his hip that he stubbornly refused to acknowledge. Around him, the terminal buzzed with the small, self-absorbed dramas of travel missed connections, fussy children, harried announcements for final boarding calls, but none of it touched him. None of it pierced the bubble of silent endurance he had wrapped around himself like a second uniform. He sat there, still as stone, his hands resting lightly on his knees, feeling the badge pressing lightly against his chest through the layers of fabric, a weight both grounding and galvanizing, a reminder that his worth had never been measured by the eyes of strangers or the casual cruelty of clerks and guards. It had been forged in harder places, in deserts and jungles, under skies ripped apart by fire and fear, and no gate agent's indifference could undo that truth. Yet even knowing this, even steeling himself against the slights and indignities, Marcus could not entirely shield himself from the gnawing sting of rejection, from the bone-deep weariness that came from fighting battles no one else could see, battles against erasure, against the slow, relentless grind of a world content to let him vanish quietly into the margins. His flight would board soon, and he would rise when called, would walk onto that plane with the same steady steps he had used to march through hostile territories, half a world away. But for now, for this brief moment, Marcus allowed himself to simply sit, to gather strength not from the hollow promises of gratitude written in history books or whispered at parades, but from the quiet, enduring knowledge of his own survival, of his own unbreakable core. He watched the planes taxiing outside the vast windows, their wings gleaming against the fading afternoon light, and somewhere deep within him, a spark of something stubborn and fierce flickered back to life, refusing to be snuffed out by the smallness of others. And as the boarding call crackled over the loudspeakers, Marcus shifted his weight, preparing once again to move forward through a world determined to push him back. Marcus rose slowly when the final boarding call echoed through the terminal, his movements deliberate, his mind steeled against the indignities already endured. And he adjusted the strap of his duffel across his shoulder, feeling the small weight of the old military badge pressing against his chest as he moved toward the gate with the quiet dignity that no humiliation could strip away. But as he stepped into the modest queue that had formed, a ripple of motion from the far end of the waiting area caught his eye. A man in a faded brown bomber jacket adorned with patches and insignias elbowing his way through the crowd, his expression a mixture of disbelief and awe as he closed the distance between them. Marcus recognized the stance instantly, the squared shoulders, the unmistakable bearing of a soldier, even decades after the uniform had been put away. And as the man drew nearer, his weathered face broke into a look of stunned recognition. He came to a halt just a few feet from Marcus, his mouth working silently for a moment before he finally found his voice, loud and clear enough to carry over the murmuring crowd. "Good God," the man said, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of revelation. "That's Marcus Hayes, the hero from the Alaska hostage rescue." At the name, heads turned sharply, conversation ceased mid-sentence, and for a moment the bustling terminal seemed to freeze in place, every eye swiveling toward Marcus with a sudden urgency that carried none of the casual contempt from before, but something new, curiosity, confusion, and the first flicker of dawning realization. Marcus stiffened slightly, unused to being recognized in public and wary of the sudden shift in attention, but he met the other man's gaze without flinching, offering a small, solemn nod of acknowledgement that only seemed to amplify the stunned reverence radiating from the stranger. "You're a damn legend, sir," Barkin continued, voice thick with emotion now, and he turned toward the crowd as if seeking witnesses, pointing at Marcus with an almost. "He saved over 300 people, civilians, soldiers, diplomats, when that compound went under siege in Alaska, stayed behind when everyone else fell back, went back in when they said it was suicide." The words broke over the gathering like a wave, scattering the last remnants of the cold, judgmental atmosphere that had surrounded Marcus minutes earlier, and a murmur rose from the crowd, growing louder with each passing second, a tide of whispered awe replacing the earlier sneers and dismissive glances. A woman in a business suit gasped audibly and clutched the sleeve of her companion, while an older man near the wall removed his hat in silent respect, his eyes wide with something very close to shame. The man in the bomber jacket stepped closer, extending a hand toward Marcus but stopping himself, clearly unsure if the gesture would be welcomed. Instead, he settled for a crisp, impromptu salute that Marcus, after a heartbeat of hesitation, returned with a solemnity that silenced the remaining murmurs around them. From the corner of his eye, Marcus caught a blur of movement as one of the airport supervisors, an older man with a silver badge pinned to his chest and a clipboard tucked under his arm, hurried toward them, his face pale and strained with the unmistakable look of a man realizing, far too late, the gravity of his mistakes. He slowed as he neared, visibly struggling to compose himself, and when he finally spoke, his voice wavered with a mixture of fear and reverence. "Sir, Mr. Hayes, I need to apologize," the supervisor stammered, his words tumbling over themselves in his haste. "We had no idea. You're the Marcus Hayes, the man who led the counter-assault in the Arctic siege, the one who pulled the wounded out when the building was collapsing." His voice broke off, choked by either awe or guilt, and he fumbled with the clipboard in his hands as if it might somehow shield him from the raw truth hanging in the air between them. Passengers clustered around the edges of the scene, their expressions a complicated tapestry of embarrassment, admiration, and silent apology. And even some of the uniformed airport staff who had earlier treated Marcus with disdain now hovered uncertainty nearby, their rigid postures betraying their growing discomfort. The supervisor cleared his throat and continued, softer now, as if the weight of his own ignorance were pressing down on him. "You're a national hero, sir. On behalf of the terminal staff, I deeply regret how you've been treated here today. Please let us make it right." Marcus regarded the man coolly for a long moment, his face a mask of impassive strength, though inside his heart beat a little harder against his ribs, not from pride, but from the sheer, surreal weight of the moment, from the sudden, jarring contrast between the callousness he had endured and the reverence now flooding the space around him. He said nothing, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable, to force the supervisor and everyone else who had borne witness to truly sit with their shame, and then, with the same measured composure he had maintained throughout every assault on his dignity, he inclined his head once, a silent acknowledgement that offered neither absolution nor condemnation. Round them, the crowd began to shift uneasily, the earlier buzz of derision now replaced by murmured apologies and awkward attempts at deference, and the transformation of the space was so total, so sudden, that it might have been comical if it were not so achingly sad. Marcus had not changed, only their perception. Him had, and the realization of that bitter truth settled over him heavier than any insult ever could. The supervisor, still visibly flustered, gestured hastily to an assistant standing nearby, and the young man rushed forward with a wheelchair, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to position it respectfully in front of Marcus. But Marcus shook his head once, firmly refusing the offer, with the same quiet authority that had carried him through fire and darkness half a world away. "I'm fine," Marcus said simply, his voice low but clear, and the young man stepped back immediately, as if physically rebuffed by the strength of the words. Another figure emerged from the background now, a second supervisor, this one wearing the insignia of senior management, his face sheet-white and glistening with a fine sheen of sweat. He approached cautiously, cradling a walkie-talkie to his chest as if awaiting orders from some invisible authority, but when he reached Marcus, he bowed slightly, an almost inviolatory gesture of deep, if belated, respect. "Sir," he said, voice trembling, "please accept our sincerest apologies. We would be honored if you would allow us to personally escort you to your seat, or if you prefer, to arrange anything you require for your comfort." But Marcus, ever composed, said nothing at first, letting the weight of the moment linger heavily in the charged air between them. Marcus stood silent and composed as the second supervisor, still visibly shaken, stammered his offer, and before Marcus could respond, a sudden ripple of motion swept through the gate area as a group of men in darker suits, wearing the distinctive lapel pins of airport executives, pushed through the thinning crowd with urgent, purposeful strides, parting the sea of onlookers as they made their way directly toward. At their center was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with silver hair, and the air of command that came not from bluster but from decades of wielding real authority. And as he approached, he removed his cap, a rare breach of protocol that signaled the gravity of the moment. His face carved into an expression of profound regret. The man extended his hand with deliberate humility and said, voice steady but thick with emotion, "Mr. Hayes, I'm Samuel Whitaker, Director of Operations for this airport, and I owe you, on behalf of everyone here, an apology of the deepest order." And the way he spoke without artifice, without the slick rehearsed tone of bureaucrats, made it clear that this was no mere formality. Marcus regarded him carefully, feeling the sudden shift in the air around them, the way the very energy of the place seemed to tilt on its axis. The disdain and suspicion of earlier swept away by a growing, almost reverent awe, and he allowed the silence to stretch just long enough to reclaim his authority. Before reaching out and shaking Whitaker's hand with a firm, steady grip, the director nodded once, sharply, as if affirming some silent oath between them, and then turned to address his assembled staff, his voice rising above the buzz of the terminal, with crisp, unquestionable authority. "Effective immediately, I am ordering a full internal review of the conduct displayed here today," he said, his words slicing through the crowd with surgical precision. "There will be accountability. And there will be changes. Because this," he gestured broadly, encompassing the humiliation Marcus had endured. "This is not who we are, and it will not stand." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered staff, some nodding earnestly, others shifting uncomfortably under the weight of their collective guilt, and Whitaker turned back to Marcus, his voice softening slightly. "Sir, if you would permit us, we would be honored to escort you to our highest-tier VIP lounge, a space reserved for heads of state and dignitaries, where you may await your flight in comfort and dignity as you deserve." Marcus hesitated, not out of pride but from a deeper instinct, the soldier's instinct to distrust sudden kindness where only scorn had existed moments before. But the sincerity in Whitaker's eyes, the urgency of the offer, made it clear that this was not about appeasement. He gave a single nod of assent, and immediately, two attendants, different faces now, ones filled with earnest respect, stepped forward to guide him gently toward the private elevator leading to the VIP suites. As they moved, the crowd parted before them, and this time the gazes that followed were not laced with judgment, but with awe, and a heavy, almost reverent silence, the kind reserved for sacred places and solemn occasions. They reached the elevator just as a second surge of motion caught Marcus's attention, an official-looking vehicle pulling up outside the terminal entrance, its flashing diplomatic lights reflecting off the glass walls, and moments later, a tall figure in full dress uniform strode through the automatic doors, his medals gleaming under the terminal's fluorescent lights. The man was a colonel, his bearing unmistakable, but as he drew closer, Marcus recognized the insignia, not of the Air Force or the Army, but of the local state defense force. And as the man approached, he removed his cap and held it respectfully against his chest. The colonel, his name adage reading Cole Richardson, stopped in front of Marcus and snapped a crisp salute, one executed with such precision and reverence that it stilled even the last murmurs in the surrounding crowd. Marcus, momentarily taken aback, returned the salute automatically, years of discipline overriding the stunned disbelief curling at the edges of his mind. "Mr. Hayes," Cole Richardson said, his voice ringing clear through the hushed terminal, "on behalf of the citizens of this state and every serviceman and servicewoman who has ever worn the uniform, it is my honor to welcome you and to express the gratitude that should have met you at every step of your journey today." He gestured toward the waiting area, where a small platform had been hastily erected by airport staff, a microphone hastily placed upon it, and a row of local dignitaries gathering awkwardly, clearly summoned in haste but standing now with heads bowed in genuine respect. "If you would allow us," Richardson continued, his voice thick with emotion, "we would like to formally recognize your service, your sacrifice, and your heroism right here, right now, so that no one ever forgets who you are or what you have given." For a moment, Marcus stood still, absorbing the enormity of the moment, the sheer unlikeliness of it, and then, feeling the weight of 1,000 silent witnesses upon him, he nodded once, gravely, and allowed the colonel to guide him toward the impromptu stage. The applause began hesitantly at first, a few claps scattered here and there, but then it swelled, rising into a thunderous standing ovation that filled the cavernous terminal with a sound so powerful it seemed to shake and Marcus, humbled and yet unbowed, walked steadily forward, the echoes of their appreciation surrounding him like a rising tide. The applause still thundered in the terminal as Marcus ascended the small platform, the deafening ovation pressing like a physical force against the walls and windows. But even as he stood before the microphone, humbled by the gesture yet steady in his composure, the machinery of accountability had already begun grinding into motion behind the scenes. Director Whitaker, his jaw set with a grim determination, was barking rapid orders into a sleek earpiece, his clipped words sending shockwaves down the chain of command that reverberated through every hallway and office of the airport. Before Marcus had even finished his short, gracious nod of acknowledgement to the gathered passengers, security teams, this time dressed in the crisp formal uniforms reserved for internal affairs, were moving swiftly and silently to intercept the very staff members who had orchestrated his humiliation. The young officer who had sneered at his prosthetic, the supervisor who had sanctioned his mistreatment, all of them were quietly but firmly ushered away from their posts, their protests muffled and cut short by the unimpeachable weight of the orders they now faced. At the far edge of the crowd, Marcus glimpsed the first officer, the one who had demanded to inspect his leg as if it were contraband, now standing rigid with a mask of fear and disbelief stretched across his previously smug face. And behind him, the gate agent, Megan, was frantically whispering into a cell phone, her expression flickering between panic and desperate hope that somehow she could salvage the shattering ruin of her career. There would be no salvation for them today. Whitaker's orders were absolute, and already official letters were being prepared, formal documents that would not merely terminate their employment, but would require each of them to pen by hand. An apology addressed not just to Marcus Hayes, but to the families of every hostage he had saved during the Alaska siege. A symbolic act meant to etch their shame into the permanent record where no amount of privilege or bureaucracy could erase it. Meanwhile, security footage from the terminal, carefully reviewed and compiled, would serve as undeniable evidence of their misconduct, to be attached to their files and circulated among industry hiring boards, ensuring that the stain of their actions would follow them wherever they sought future employment. As the news of the firings and mandatory apologies spread through the staff like wildfire, a tremor of unease passed through the assembled crowd, and those passengers who had earlier snickered or looked on with smug superiority now stood awkwardly at the fringes, their faces flushed with shame, their hands clasped tightly or wringing nervously as if seeking some absolution that would not come. Marcus, descending from the platform after receiving Richardson, a gesture offered without pomp but laden with profound meaning, passed among them. Without hurry, his pace steady, his gaze fixed forward, and as he moved, the former mockers instinctively lowered their heads, their eyes falling to the polished floor tiles, unable to meet the steady, unwavering gaze of the man they had once judged unworthy. They had expected him to gloat, perhaps to sneer, or lash out with the righteous anger they knew they deserved. But Marcus did none of these things. He simply walked past them, his silence heavier than any rebuke, carrying with him the full weight of dignity reclaimed and justice restored, his very presence a living testament to resilience that needed no words to condemn or forgive. Man, a businessman, who earlier had scoffed audibly when Marcus first boarded, shifted uneasily from foot to foot, clearing his throat as if preparing to offer some mumbled apology. But when Marcus passed without pausing, without even flickering an acknowledgement in his direction, the man fell silent, his attempted contrition crumbling into dust under the crushing simplicity of being deemed unworthy even of a second glance. It was not cruelty that moved Marcus to ignore them. It was the pure, immutable truth that some wrongs were beyond the power of shallow words to right, that some lessons could only be learned through the sting of being rendered invisible to the one you had tried to diminish. At the security checkpoint, a fresh set of agents now stood at rigid attention, their faces open and respectful, their bodies practically vibrating with the desire to make amends, not for personal guilt but for the institutional betrayal that had marred this day. And when Marcus approached, the senior-most officer, a woman with close-cropped hair and a chest full of commendations, stepped forward and saluted sharply before wordlessly gesturing him through without further inspection, a silent atonement for the indignities previously inflicted. Marcus inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement and passed through, the clatter of his prosthetic striking the floor, in a rhythm that now sounded not weary but triumphant, a drumbeat of survival that echoed long after he had moved beyond their view. The VIP lounge awaited him once more, its doors opened wide by attendants who stood, not as gatekeepers, but as silent honor guards. And as Marcus crossed the threshold, the heavy glass doors swung closed behind him with a soft whoosh, cutting off the last lingering stares of the humbled crowd. Yet even inside, he did not immediately seek the plush couches or the offered champagne. Instead, he found a quiet corner overlooking the runway, where the planes sat lined like sentinels against the burnished evening sky. And he stood there a long while, his reflection ghosted faintly in the glass, not as a figure diminished by the day's events, but as one carved deeper by them, sharpened into something enduring and unbreakable. Marcus stood by the towering window of the VIP lounge, his figure framed against the golden hues of the setting sun. The glint of airplanes on the tarmac stretching out like distant memories of battles fought and miles traveled, and for a while he allowed himself the rare luxury of stillness, a moment stolen from the ceaseless current of movement and noise that defined modern life. Yet, even in this oasis of calm, change was stirring, moving quietly toward him like a ripple across a glassy lake. The soft knock on the doorframe behind him was hesitant, almost tentative, and Marcus turned slowly to find one of the last faces he expected to see. The young female gate agent, Megan, who had once coldly stripped him of dignity with bureaucratic efficiency, now standing there with trembling hands clasped tightly in front of her, her polished professionalism stripped away, replaced by raw human vulnerability. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her shoulders slumped, not in false contrition, but in the undeniable weight of genuine remorse, and she stepped into the room with the uncertain gait of someone approaching not just a man, but a reckoning long overdue. Marcus said nothing, merely watched her with a steady, unreadable gaze that forced her to fill the silence with her own courage, or crumble under it. Megan's voice, when it finally came, was cracked and thin but carried the fragile strength of truth. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her words catching on a sob she fought to swallow down. "I'm so sorry for how I treated you. I didn't see you. Not really, I just saw what I thought I knew and I was wrong." She paused, breathing shakily, and when Marcus still did not speak, she rushed on, desperate not for absolution but to spill out the dam inside her before it drowned her completely. "After what happened," she said, "after I realized who you were, not just your name but what you stood for, what you are, I went home, and I couldn't look at myself in the mirror. I couldn't pretend it was just a mistake or a misunderstanding. I realized I didn't know anything about the sacrifices made by people like you, about the real cost of freedom that I take for granted every single day." Her voice broke again, but she pressed forward, gripping the words like a lifeline. "I've already resigned from my position here. It's not enough, I know that, but I've enrolled in a program, a military history course at the community college, and I've signed up to volunteer at the local Veterans Center. I want to understand. I want to serve even in some small way to honor what people like you gave up for the rest of us. It's the least I can do." Her eyes filled with tears she made no attempt to hide now, and she stood there, stripped of all pretense, awaiting his judgment like a supplicant before a king. But Marcus, steady and calm, did not respond immediately. He studied her carefully, not to savor her discomfort but to measure the sincerity of her transformation, to weigh the difference between regret and true awakening. Finally, he stepped forward, each movement deliberate, and when he spoke, his voice was soft but carried the weight of granite. "Justice," Marcus said, his deep, even tone slicing through the heavy silence, "is not about revenge. Justice is about change." The words hung in the air, simple yet profound, and in that moment, something shifted not just within Megan, who sagged with relief and gratitude under the power of his forgiveness, but within the very fabric of the room itself, as if the walls and windows and floors bore witness to a truth too great for silence to contain. Megan nodded through her tears, unable to speak, and Marcus, with the barest hint of a smile touching the corner of his mouth, placed a steady hand on her shoulder, a gesture that said without words, "Go forward, do better, be better." Behind Megan, unnoticed until now, others had gathered, drawn by some instinct deeper than curiosity. Passengers who had once sneered, staff members who had only heard whispers of what had transpired. They stood now in silent witness to the act unfolding before them, an act not of triumph but of grace, and as they watched Marcus offer forgiveness, not with grand gestures but with the simple, unyielding strength of his presence, something unspoken passed among them. A collective understanding that change was not born from humiliation or punishment, but from the willingness to seek, to admit, to rise. One by one, almost unconsciously, heads bowed not in forced deference but in genuine respect. And as Marcus turned back to the window, watching the last rays of sunlight slip below the horizon, the terminal behind him seemed to exhale, the heavy weight of shame and regret giving way to something lighter, something closer to hope. His flight would board soon, and he would go on to wherever the next chapter of his life called him. But here, in this moment, something lasting had been built from the ruins of ignorance and cruelty. A bridge not yet complete but rising nonetheless, strong enough perhaps to carry others across the chasm of their own blindness, and into a future shaped not by prejudice but by understanding. As the lounge attendants, previously stiff with apprehension, now moved to assist him with quiet, reverent efficiency, Marcus allowed himself a final glance back at Megan, still standing there with her hands pressed over her heart, her face wet with tears, but shining with something far stronger than sorrow: resolve. Without another word, Marcus picked up his duffel, the old military badge still tucked securely over his heart, and made his way toward the boarding gate, his steps steady, his spirit unbowed. And behind him, in the silence left by his passing, a new beginning took root, fragile but real, born not from anger but from the fierce, unbreakable seed of grace. Before we continue, if you find stories like this moving, inspiring, or thought-provoking, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more powerful narratives. We would love to hear from you. What part of Marcus's journey struck you the most? And where in the world are you watching from today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice makes this community stronger.